So the first thing I want to do is praises to you for the amount of research and noodling that you've done in a lane that's been going on for at least a decade. And I think when I was trying to reverse engineer how your awareness came to the topics, Science Friday, you made it onto Science Friday. That was what, 2014 or 15, right?
Yeah, it's been a long journey for sure. And, it always helps when you have to talk about helping dolphins.
Right now, God, yeah, you win. Like my kids would think I was super cool if I got on something like Science Friday. Like, who cares that you have a YouTube channel? No. If you did something like, Science Friday, anyway. But the praise for that was at the beginning of the story, which we're into this a decade for you. There was this discovery that something about a saturated fat, which can be sound like it's naughty, especially in 2015. We've had less demonization of those saturated fats over the past decade, at least in the space I've been hanging out in. But then there was also this shift that you went from one saturated fat of odd chains on both sides, meaning it was C17, and now you talk about C15. So why don't you do a brief introduction of how you landed Science Friday talking about C17 and how today's world talks about the C15?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it was this whole discovery. Dr. Boz, was an accident, a wonderful accident, all happening that we talked about while taking care of Navy dolphins as a veterinary epidemiologist, and so that's where we were able to leverage metabolomics. I'm so impressed with how deep you read into these papers. Bless you for getting through all of that science. So when we were first looking at the dolphins, we used basically just a fatty acid panel. So we were, to be honest, we did a bias study in which we were assuming that our hypothesis was that omega-3s were what's dictating which dolphins were aging healthier than other dolphins, because all they eat are fish. So we did a fatty acid panel, but the fatty acid panel ended up having more than the omega-3s. It had like 33 different fatty acids in it. So when we did that first study, and that was that first paper that we published in PLOS One, showed that C17 was the predictor, an independent predictor of dolphins with lower insulin levels, lower ferritin, kind of this, we'll probably get into it, this syndrome that was very distinct in the dolphins, and also coincidentally starting to see this rise in people. So C17 it was. We went forward with it, and we said, okay, that's great, it's association, but now let's put C17 to the test in the lab. So we moved C17 into the lab, and that's when we started this body of work with Dr. Ed Dennis, who's the head of, was the editor-in-chief for the Journal for Lipid Research for 15 years, and really saying, okay, let's put C17 to the test and see if it's not just associated with better health in dolphins, but actually has causations or activities that are clinically relevant. So we started doing that, and while we were doing it, we said, well, we better test it against other saturated fats. So we compared C17 in the lab against 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. And so when we did that and we ran it against this really robust panel, it was just a bunch of different studies, actually, receptor-based studies, cell-based studies. That's when we found that indeed it was actually C15 that was the Goldilocks saturated fat. In mouse studies, it had efficacy. Giving a mouse pure C15 had successfully lowered their insulin, their glucose, inflammatory markers. They gained less weight on a high-fat diet. C17 did some of these things, but not great. And this was actually then repeated by Bishop et al. A couple of years ago in a study they published in which they showed C15 is great, C17 was meh. So from there, we really leaned in understanding C15 is a stronger PPAR alpha delta agonist. It had greater efficacy in an in vivo model. And when we really started looking into it, we learned that C15 was the only one that met the criteria of being essential. So meaning our bodies need it, our bodies don't make enough of it. So long story short, we were actually able to show that when we eat C15, our bodies actually use C15 to make C17.
Okay, so that was something else that I read in one of the studies. Like, I love biochemistry just enough to be great as a physician. So then you leave a lot of that, 25, 30, whatever it's been since I've taken those classes. But I actually went back to say, how does our body elongate, add carbons to a fat? And I don't know how that works. So I'm like, what enzyme does that? So how does that work? That you can take a C15 and end up with a functional C17, which is how you would be able to remove the essential label of a C17 that, no, our bodies do something like that. So explain that.
That's right. So I was also learning that same thing. And that when we saw, we're like, okay, so when you give a mouse C15, their C15 levels went up, but so did their C17 levels go up. So we said, okay, that actually helps explain a big question that's been in the human literature, which is why are C17 levels in our bodies always higher than C15? When you look at what's in food, it's actually the opposite. So it's been this question of why the discrepancy. And so this was able to solve for it, that C17 is higher because we have C15 goes C17. We're used to thinking about molecules breaking down. So C15 going to, and what's right. And they typically, as they get metabolized, saturated fats, they go by twos. So an odd chain saturated fat always stays an odd chain. It goes from C15 to C13, so all the way down to propionic acid. C3, which has all its own wonderful properties. So that made sense. So same question you had, which is like, what? It's getting longer? So there are actually these genes, and they're called ELOVL. I think it's ELOVL. And then there's like an ELOVL 6, 7, 8. And it ends up that there was a group that had already done studies showing that it's this specific gene that then enables C15 to, specifically for C15 to elongate to C17. So it's all these little pieces and hints have been out there, but you know, they're not just, there you go. You have the question. Here's the answer.
Well,
you just really had to go.
I'll tell you, the double-clicking depth of rabbit hole. By the time I'm reading the study that was talking about elongating the chain, I'm like, every fourth word I'm having to look up again, going, what does that do? What does that do? Meaning, it is so nuanced inside the world, and I just didn't have a framework that said you can grow fatty chains in the human body. Like, is there another place that we know that happens?
I think so. I think there are other examples where they can get longer. And you know, what's really providing a lot of helpful insight on this are these like complex lipidomic studies where they're looking at, you know, we're used to talking about something maybe up to C20, C22 chains, even from like talking about omega-3s. And but now we're understanding with these advanced lipidomics of what's circulating in our bodies, there's like C56, C56. And so those aren't coming from foods. We're learning that our bodies, just as much as you know, of decreasing and breaking down molecules, they're also building and making really complex lipids. So it's just a new world for us. And I think, you know, we're just learning a lot as these omics are making their way, you know, into our world.
Well, we can say push reset in my mind. Okay, file that into a place that, you know, you add more data as life goes on. I need a few trips around the sun to get all this squared away. So it's another place where I do have a distant memory of there being a difference between fatty acids that are odd chained and even chained, and like they have like a personality almost, that this class is one and this class is the other. Can you share just the general idea of the difference between odd chain fatty acids versus even? Meaning, are there carbons that are odd number of carbons or an even number of carbons?
Yeah, I love the personality analogy. It resonates well. So, you know, we've all put saturated fats, like you've mentioned, into one kind of naughty category. It is now indisputable. This isn't just our science. There's lots and lots of science, right, showing that not all saturated fats are created equally, just like you just said. So the odd chain saturated fats, just like you said, is dependent upon the number of carbons. So odd number of carbons in the chain, it's automatically an odd chain saturated fatty acids. So if it's an odd chain, and primarily it's C15 and C17, that these repeatedly are associated with better health in people. So lower risk of diabetes, of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, of fatty liver disease, and a lot of other conditions, keeping in mind association, right? Not causation, but multiple studies showing that. And then in those same studies, a lot of those same studies show the opposite for even chain. So even chain saturated fats associated with a higher risk of these diseases. And a lot of these papers were written to basically show the second part of that story, that saturated fats are bad for us. So they leaned on the even chain results. And to be fair, in foods, there's much higher levels of these even chain saturated fats. So they had a good reason to lean on them. But they kind of were like C15, C17 didn't fit with the story. They're present at such low levels. It was just kind of written as, oh, and by the way, there's a couple, these odd chains, the opposite of what we found with the even chains. But really the big story is saturated fats are bad for you. So and then as far as mechanism, probably the strongest contender for, there are two explanations for why one carbon would make a difference. So we're basically saying C15 is good and C16 is bad, which is remarkable, right? Like how could one carbon make that difference? So what we now know is that these even chain saturated fats are pro-inflammatory, not across every single cytokine, but they're actively used in studies to induce inflammation, to induce, diabetes and heart disease. So we know that these even chain saturated fats are pro-inflammatory and induce a disease state. And then the other reason why even chains are different is because they, as they get metabolized, right? So from C16, 2 carbons, 14, 12, and so on, when it gets down to acetoacetic acid, and that feeds a kind of diabetes, pro-inflammatory pathway. So that's why the even chains on the odd chains on the other side, they're the opposite. They're anti-inflammatory, especially C15 decreased over 18 pro-inflammatory cytokines in a dose-dependent manner. And when it gets metabolized, it goes right all the way down to C3, which is propionic acid, which is kind of does the opposite of acetoacetic acid. So it becomes simpler once you start piecing together the different studies out there. But it's still remarkable that nature has made such a difference between one carbon.
Well, it helps me when I think of most of that, metabolic processes and fueling of any type of breakdown. Those carbons like to break off in pairs, so to chink it down by 2 carbon units at a time, it helps you to say, okay, here's where once they start at this link, they're kind of in that same thread of leading towards an endpoint that not all fats are broken down all the way to the end, but when they are, that tends to be in that lane. You've said something that I hope my audience heard, and I'm just going to double click on this at the beginning of this so they can hear this. When we say saturated fats, that means that as all that string of carbon are lined up, that there is a complete parking spots are all filled in the places where those hydrogen bonds could bind. When we look at a polyunsaturated fat, there are places where a double bond holds that fat together, and you would essentially see the absence of that hydrogen molecule and its bond. When you look at the shape of that fat, in a saturated fat, it's very symmetrical. It's lovely. It follows, this nice, right? You don't have to remember which chain did it have the double bond and how does that link. In the polyunsaturated fats, the first two that come to my mind are the essential polyunsaturated fats of omega-3 and omega-6. And again, those personalities tend to like sort in my mind. Oh yeah, the 3 is great and the 6 is bad. And that's not a simple, and that's not even the correct simplification. I don't know if you've seen the New York Times in the last 2 days article on how seed oils, or fact checking the government people who say seed oils are bad. See, look right here. We have this study where we added linoleic acid and their diabetes went down. And again, linoleic acid, folks, is it's a seed oil, often derived from seed oils, but it's also polyunsaturated. It's not a saturated fat, and it's an even chain. So it would be in the, evil band. It's supposed to be bad for you. But there's a study, there's more than one that says human consumption of them decrease the diabetes, decrease the heart disease, decrease the obesity, decrease the what? So yeah, if you want to add confusion, we can keep going. So I say that to clarify to the audience, don't try to put these in Cliff Notes and take them as truths. They are, well, it's the part we love about science. It's messy. It's going to take us a while to sort out how does that lead to that. And
yeah, exactly. And it's amazing if you think about, even if you look at a saturated fat, which just like you said, is so simple, and you just change the carbon number, it completely changes, like you said, its personality behavior. Imagine if you go into this polyunsaturated world, or it becomes much more complicated. Any little change can completely change what the role of this molecule will do. So it's a fantastic message that every fatty acid has its own story to tell, and that it's really difficult to put them in a single group.
Well, I think that lets us go to the next chapter of what you come across the C17 now down to C15, and we've got, okay, this molecule seems unique. Those animals on your coast, meaning in San Diego, where you happen to work with the veterinary teams. Is it the Navy? Is it the Naval? Okay, I've got it all straight. It's been a while since I read that, and they're not getting C15, but I live in Tampa now, so just south of me in Sarasota, they have the other dolphin pod that you compared them to, and they're in the wild. Is that right? That they were getting sources of fish that had this C15 in it, and then the two of them, there was like, wow, look at the difference. So explain what you found there, and then we'll go to the next step.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, it was probably, I had been was with the program for about 15, it's been 20 years since I started with the program. I still work with them. So the dolphins we're still doing great work to help the dolphins, continually help the dolphins there. And so I had been there, Annette, for probably about 5 years. And then we started seeing this syndrome appear. We started seeing elevations in liver enzymes pop up. And this was only caught because the dolphins get routine blood checkups as often as once a month. If you can imagine with your patients, if it's like, hey, feeling great, just still come on in, let's get you a blood test every month. So invaluable data with regard to what's happening in these dolphins over their lifetime. So what we found was that we had about 1 in 3 dolphins within the Navy population and they were older, but and I'll just leave it at that. But they were seeing, once we dug in, higher insulin, elevated liver enzymes, what's a measurement of high ferritin, of hyperferritinemia, this sign of iron overload. And it was progressing over time. So it was kind of a mystery of there's a subset of dolphins and we couldn't figure out what was happening. When we then compared the population of Navy dolphins with the Sarasota Bay dolphins, which this is an amazing team that assesses the health of the wild dolphins in Sarasota Bay, and they've been doing this for 40 years, same as the Navy, we weren't seeing this syndrome in basically any of the wild dolphins. So that allowed us to say, okay, we've got 3 cohorts, the Navy dolphins that don't have this syndrome, Navy dolphins that have the syndrome, and then wild dolphins who just don't have the syndrome at all. So when we had then moved to metabolomics, because we got smarter to saying, don't make any assumptions on what's predicting the difference. And when we use metabolomics, that opened it up to 467 molecules. And to say, let's really put this to the test, because this is fish, not a fatty acid, right, supplement. So We did use metabolomics, and lo and behold, right there at the top predictor of the healthiest dolphins that did not have this syndrome, whether it was the healthy Navy dolphins or the Sarasota Bay dolphins, C15 was the highest predictor of the health. So we're like, okay, now we have two. First pointed to C17 odd chain, and now we're seeing C15 rise to the top.
Well, and as you did that, what the other part of that research that held in my brain because of its, it felt like that gravity mattered in was the longevity and something that if we find a cure for longevity in our medical careers, we're going to die before they're implemented. But when you hear, right, like only somebody else's benefit, but that's okay. Welcome to human race. When it comes to the dolphins, though, it was you had several generations in that dolphin pod that you could see. Well, their parents didn't have this. And specifically their grandparents had this longer life. And now these younger ones are getting it quicker, faster. And it's not like today I was watching the debate about, can the seed oils really be as evil as they say? And like it's associated with Doritos and all the processed foods and deep frying and canola oil. And the debate is interesting to watch because I think it is a valuable lesson in be careful what you conclude. Try to keep your brain from connecting the dots too quickly. And in this case, especially, is another great example. Here you've got these dolphins that lived a long time. Their lifespans are this. They are not eating junk food. They are not eating, processed food.
Much cleaner. Yeah.
Right. But they are captivated so that their food sources are probably not what they would have been in the wild. And then, so there's a difference there. So maybe kind of parse out how you could how you looked at the food source that was going into the dolphins who had the lower C15 and why that was just a huge distinction in the algorithm for their longevity.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it put these populations in this perfect sweet spot. Like you're saying, if humans were so complicated, right? That to be able to even just track what I ate this week versus last week would be a mess, right? Yeah. So there's a lack of consistency. While with the Navy dolphins, they record and they know every type of fish they eat from even specific lots every day, and that's recorded throughout their entire life. So, and like you said, we have generations, and we had archived serum and archived tissues from great-great-grandparents. So a tremendous resource we had that was much cleaner than what's in people. So because C15 was a fatty acid, we were then able to, and we knew we had measured it in fish. So the Navy dolphins they have an option of 5 different types of fish. And it ends up that what was determining those who had low versus higher C15 was what amount they were getting of these different types of fish. So some fish had 0 C15 in it. So squid, I don't know if I'm allowed to call that a fish, but part of the food they were given. Another one of theirs, it's fading me right now, but there was another fish that of capelin that they commonly got, and that had no detectable C15 in it. While there were other dolphins that were getting less of those fish and more of things like mackerel and herring, and those had higher C15 levels. Meanwhile, we look at Sarasota Bay dolphins, and they're eating pinfish and mullet, which are relatively chock full of C15. So we had this really cool groups where we were able to say where it was coming together, again, from a non-biased way because of the metabolomics. Because we said, what if it's an amino acid that we weren't even looking for? So it measured everything. And so that's where it all pointed to C15. And we were able to show that C15 levels were directly reflected, just like in people, by how much they were getting from their diet. So it kind of ended up becoming the perfect fatty acid to focus on because it's controllable. It's less about how much our bodies are making of it, and much more about what they were eating.
So let's make sure that we explain the word metabolomics. Let me explain one thing my patients do, or I encourage them to do, is I tell them to order a few tests online that they can prick their finger, drip some blood onto a sponge, and send that into a lab where the lab looks at essentially the skin cells of those red blood cells and measures how much omega-3, how much omega-6, or even your hemoglobin, how many of those hemoglobin are splat full of are glycated with a glucose. So those tests are not genomic. They are measurements of fatty acids in your red blood cells, or in the other case, hemoglobin A1C. So explain the genomic testing that you did to be confident in what you were seeing as that marker that sent a signal.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at metabolomics, it's basically measuring. It's limited to small molecules. So it's measuring all the small molecules in our blood. So not just the fatty acids in the fatty acid panel. So it's measuring those because those are small molecules, but it's also including amino acids, carbohydrates. It could even be contaminants that are coming from who knows what. So it's like taking a fatty acid panel and then just blowing it up and then saying, but not limiting it to lipids and fatty acids, but to all the other things that are in our blood, but meaningful because they're small molecules, which means you can take that small molecule then and then put it to the test. So it's Nick Shork, who he's the head of longevity of NIH's longevity consortium. The dolphin population was brought to his attention 10 years ago. And he was like, oh my gosh, this dolphin population is going to be able to answer so many questions we have in humans. And he loved the metabolomics because he's like, if you find a small molecule, you can do something about it. That's something that you can put to work versus saying, oh, we found a gene. And then you're always left with that, like, okay, well, how do we turn a gene up and down? And it just gets really complicated. So we were sticking with, hey, this makes a difference. So we can take it in the lab and then we can test it. And then you can actually feed it and increase your levels to make a difference.
It is great because when you're looking at I've been in medicine now 25 years. And if I look at the next 25 years, especially the amount of information that I feel like I don't have all straight. I constantly have to keep saying, oh, I got that wrong again, and let's refile that in my mind. But to look at the power that would be behind measuring such a micro nutrient or micromolecule, and then fast forwarding that, some of the critics for the C15 are like, well, how could you possibly get a benefit with such a small amount? And well, how does it exactly work? And all good questions. But as you take the footprint from where we've been and say, one of the best YouTube videos I ever made that did not get a lot of clicks and the world didn't love it, but I loved it, is when I was sorting in my mind why it was so important to have this mosaic of different types of fats inside your cell lining. And that when you added these naughty fats of saturated fats, it was great because you now had this flexibility of what your cell could do. It had more pliability. It was much more stable. Not to deny that an omega-3 wasn't going to be something you still wanted in that cell, but you could say other things like you don't want that trans fat really makes things brittle. And so the properties of the fat were something that, as much as I may have learned it in the past, I was really understanding it when you could say, oh, you've got to have all of these, and especially a good footprint for these saturated fats if you're going to make a nice, resilient, healthy cell, especially if you've had brain injury, because that's what a lot of my clinic is all right, if we're going to repair that brain, we need some saturated fats that are going to be in the lining of these astrocytes. So we got to get it on the other side of that blood-brain barrier, and we need the right type of fat in line to be part of that cell. So having said that, if you look at studying this, so you see the signal of C15, you've got these health markers that reflect metabolic health, which again, we've bastardized how to measure that, screw it up, and tell patients the wrong thing for 25 years on that too. But now you say, well, let's take this, and in several cell cultures of our systems, we're going to test it. So explain how you set that study up and what you were looking at in those, I think it was a dozen, maybe a couple dozen cell cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was our next question, and that, which is just like, okay, is it active? So is it actually an active molecule, a bioactive molecule that does good things, is safe for cells, and at what doses? So does it have a dose response effect? And so at the time, we were actually moving forward and evaluating C15 as a pharmaceutical for this syndrome that included fatty liver disease. And so our mindset was not about bringing this forward as a supplement or an essential fatty acid at the time. It was like, hey, we've discovered a molecule that could have therapeutic properties. And we're in San Diego, which is a major like biotech hub. And so all of our advisors and all of us, we're all always thinking biotech. So we then took pure free fatty acid C15 and put it to the test. So one of the first things you do in the pharma industry is there is a test called Biomap, and this is a third party that does it. It is an extensive, robust 12 human cell systems that mimic various disease states. And what they do is, and they take primary human cells. And that's important because if you just take cells that, like, you grow cells in a lab and you just regrow and regrow and regrow them, when that happens, that kind of changes. Yeah. It gets further and further from it. So these are primary cells, fresh from people, donors, into these cell lines. And then what they do is they then insult these different cell lines with what they call stimulants, which then triggers a response that mimics heart disease, psoriasis, COPD, so various responses. Of these 12, within these 12 human cell systems, there are 146 different biomarkers that they're reading out. And that allows Biomap to take a molecule, you then take these disease systems, expose them to your molecule at 4 doses, and then they read these 146 biomarkers. And to say that when you treat these cell systems, these diseases in a dish with your molecule, do we see these biomarkers go up or down in a way that is statistically significantly different than non-treated controls? And then even better, then they also test safety. Does it kill the cells? Because it's not just for efficacy, but if it kills the cells, it's a good way to assess safety of a compound. So that is why we chose it. The other thing is they automatically test the profile. So you get a profile readout, which is called cell-based phenotypic profiling of all these measurements, 4 different doses, 146 different measurements. And they then compare that profile against known drugs. And they can say, we predict that this molecule will behave like X at this concentration. So they did all the fancy work that we just provided it and said, tell us how it went. So the result of that was that we were able to show that indeed C15 was active, that it had a 36 dose response benefit. So not just a significant positive effect, better than the non-treated controls, but that it had a dose response effect. And it had to be an effect that was greater than 20% beyond that significant value. So using this third party, that's how they identified these. And importantly, these benefits were across 10 out of 12 of the systems, which indicates it has broad effects across the body. And it was safe at all 4 concentrations. So the phenotypic profile that came back from this report was so remarkable that the lead of the program at this third party, who we did not know, called us up and said, I need to make sure you know. She said, I have seen tens of thousands of molecules run through the system. I need you to know that you're sitting on something really important. And so anyway, it's
so fun. That's so fun. That feels good.
We better keep, we're like, well, I guess we better keep moving. moving along.
And that's a long ways from Science Friday, but you probably had, I don't even know if you have those dreams at the beginning because you're like, I don't know what it is.
Not at all.
Yeah, the curiosity is where most fun stories begin. And honestly, it has to be curiosity to keep people engaged that long. Every other thing will wear off, like greed and suffering.
Oh yeah, and we're exactly. And at the Navy, we're all about fail fast. You're not afforded the time to pursue something that is not going to result in something that's going to help, at that time to help the dolphins. There's no like, oh, Steph, you found something that piques your curiosity. You can just play with that for your career and publish a bunch of studies. For us at the military, you're given, this was all funded by Office of Naval Research. It's like, pursue it. If it doesn't work, fail fast and you're done. But if it's working, you get more money. And the goal is to create a product and a way to intervene and help the dolphins. So it's just it sounds silly and it sounds simple, but that's just the military.
We'll take that accountability. I mean, I've got people hanging out in the lane that I think you're never going to get to an answer. I mean, they are not, and I don't know how they do it because I would lose focus. I would just be like, suck my soul out and spit it in the garbage, right? Yeah, no way. I have to be curious and interested in. Well, maybe they are, but it looks like a lot. Well, so take this further into that because these were some of the questions I wrote down. I was just looking at when you look at a saturated fat that were going into these different cell cultures, and you were getting some of these outcomes. Do you have a sense? I mean, there's several of them that talk about the anti-inflammatory effect. There's several of them that talk about an improved mitochondrial function. I mean, people use the word anti-aging. I try to stay away from it because I think it's really broad, but they love that. Of course, every marketing team loves that. And then the cell membrane integrity. And I thought, well, it's saturated fat, so you've got that one on your side. But so go into the ideas of that you hopefully I'm sure you've thought about, but hopefully others have said, let's consider what could be the mechanism that a saturated fat would be causing this.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. So we went from like strong association with better health in dolphins and seeing that same pattern in human epidemiological studies to now moving into the lab to human parts and showing like, yes, it's directly causing benefits in these systems. And so what's the middle part of that? Exactly like you're pointing to, Annette, which is like, what is the mechanism of action and what's the concentration? Does it match what we're seeing? Because it's really important, like you said, it's not just does it have an effect, but does it have an effect at a concentration that makes sense given these tiny doses, right? In small amounts. So what we had seen in the cell-based studies was that the sweet spot was around 20 micromolars of C15 was hit the most benefits in these cell lines, which matches people, at least where people used to be in their C15 levels before we took whole fat dairy out of our diet. So that was a really important clue to us that it's like, okay, this is actually achievable and it makes sense that this is a level that we should have in our bodies. So those are two really important clues. So then from there, we moved into, so then we looked at mechanism of action and we said, okay, how is it working? So we chose PPAR receptors because we're like metabolism, diabetes, inflammation, this makes sense. And we also know that fatty acids have a variety that one of the reasons we have PPAR receptors is specifically waiting for dietary fats. So when we tested C15 against PPARs, we found that it activated specifically PPAR alpha and PPAR delta. So that was kind of that first check mark of like, okay, we actually have a mechanism of action, and it was between 2 and 50 micromolars for the sweet spot. So again, it's like, okay, we're seeing the same concentration in 3 different places, what the human body should have, what was effective in the cell lines, and now what is successfully activating these receptors in cell lines.
Let me get my head straight because it's been a while since I've looked at some of these diagrams. So that PPAR alpha and PPAR delta, those receptors, are they on the cytoplasmic cell lining or are they on the mitochondrial cell.
Cytoplasmic cell line.
Okay,
Yeah.
so a cell's signal of a a fatty acid that could bind to that would send a message through that from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, and it's activating the alpha and the delta of the PPAR. So
That's right.
what does that turn into? I don't know. I don't know that.
Right. So why do we care? So the important part of this is that PPARs, and there's alpha, delta, and gamma.
I know. I think of gamma, and I keep wanting to say that. I'm like, why do I have that one?
Like the glutazones.
Oh, that's what it is. Yeah, I'm sorry. There must be pathology. I know that one in my head.
Fibrates are PPAR alpha.
Okay.
Agonists.
Okay.
PPAR delta. There's been a hunt for PPAR delta therapeutics, but they've been hit or miss. So when you activate PPARs, these are known orchestrators of our metabolism and our immunity. So specifically, metabolism with regard to insulin, glucose. You think about the glutazones, and then and fat burning with regard to the PPAR delta component of it, and then and it also has anti-inflammatory components. So again, this was matching up with because we threw it against a bunch of different receptors, 47 different therapeutic targets. And it was the PPAR alpha delta that was the most exciting in the set that we did. So that's where we said, this all makes sense. And the dolphins, dolphins with low C15 were developing metabolic and inflammatory related conditions. When we treat these conditions in a cell dish with C15, we see the inflammatory markers go down, and that matches the concentration with the mechanism of action. So that helping together. Since then, however, there's over 100 peer-reviewed papers on C15's benefits at discoverc15.com. So people who want to nerd out and read all the peer-reviewed papers, there's now that gets into the longevity space. So in addition to, you talked about stabilizing the cell membrane, just being part of the cell membrane pacemaker theory of aging from A.J. Holbert, showing that the stronger the cell membrane, the longer a species lives as a mammal. So what helps define how humans live longer than mice. But in addition, others have now since shown that C15 also, it's a promiscuous molecule, pleiotropic, right, is our word for it. So it also activates AMPK. It inhibits mTOR. So now we're getting longevity, like all of a sudden it's like, okay, now we're in the longevity space. And then, we talked about it with regard to repairing mitochondria. We start working down the hallmarks of aging that define how we age at the cellular level. And to date, it's ours, but really now others have been able to check off 6 of the hallmarks of aging. So again, feeding into, we're supposed to have C15 just to maintain our baseline health and specifically to help enable the longevity that humans have over mice. And if we don't have enough C15, what the data are showing and supporting is that our aging in our cells and us can accelerate, which explains why younger dolphins were getting older dolphin diseases and why younger kids today are getting diseases their grandparents before their parents. And so that's why a lot of urgency behind these conversations and, being able to talk to wonderful people like you is we've just got to get the conversation going because there's still a lot to learn. But if we're right, then we can help. Yeah, we can do something really meaningfully for the world, importantly, safely, and through lots of things, through food, dietary changes, agricultural changes. The supplement is just one part of the solution, but it's really meant to be a global movement to increase awareness of all the science that's happening now.
Well, when you look at the first, when you started saying the longevity, I instantly hear this echoing noise of Peter Attia and his discovery or his drive to better understand how rapamycin might extend life and mTOR and all of the oh man, that's a nerd level that I actually enjoy reading it, but I've learned don't try to get my audience to think that deeply. Essentially, looking at how well that cell shuts off and dies, or at least becomes very wimpy and not robust. And you look at some of the people. Have you read any of the people who dose rapamycin? Yeah, and you say, I dose right up until the point where I have bleeding mouth ulcers, and then I back down on the dose. And I'm like, crazy, crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's such a complicated, like, it has amazing properties, right? It's like, it's anti-cancer, anti-fibrotic, antifungal, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. Great. But it is also a super complicated molecule. Like, if you look at a picture of rapamycin, it is a mess. And it was found, it's a product of bacteria that grow on Easter Island.
Yeah, like only freakish things live there. Why are you taking that? You're scaring
so clearly, this is not something we were all meant to have. But interestingly, within rapamycin, there is a 15 carbon chain.
Oh, really?
So
isn't that funny?
what we're looking at is that when you look at, we actually compared, we used that same biomap profile to compare to put C15 head to head against rapamycin and metformin and carbos. And Peter Attia actually called this paper out a few months ago as like research worth watching, of where we showed that they share very similar properties, except like ours has this amazing safety because it's in milk. It's what every mammal gets from birth. So it's like, maybe we don't have to go all the way to Easter Island for this wacky molecule that has, like you said, all these side effects, that instead it was just giving us a hint of what we have needed all along, which is, let's not.
Yeah. And I've had many people say, well, I prescribe. I'm like, you should go to somebody else for that. There are so many problems that I want you to lower your insulin, get your body mass index down, get your brain clear, and your hair to grow again. Let's start there. But it is in that moment where you, in my world, you meet patients and you could say, gosh, if I could push back time. You've aged inappropriately. You are on a highway in the wrong direction. And, our company recently has been struggling with what is the right way to help them with tools like, the GLP-1 GIP agonists, because there's 51 of them about to hit the market through the FDA. And, that isn't because they're not useful, but it is an equation of what does that mean? Where does that play forward? How does that turn out in 10 years? All of that are worthy of contemplation and just mindfulness of saying, what are you saying yes to and what are you not saying yes to? So as you look at some of the conversations that I've seen folks go a little crazy on, saying C15 is how I'm treating my diabetes. C15 is how I'm reversing my heart disease. And you see them want for that reversal. The road to hell, we're both paved with good intentions. How can we, respecting they've got one lifespan. We don't know what they get. I love every place I've tried to look at C15's danger, you can hardly find it. I mean, price is one thing, but if you look at, am I hurting them? Are they taking the drug to the point of bleeding mouth ulcers? Unless I've missed something, there's a pretty easy safety profile. But speak into the wisdom that might need to come for somebody who really understands this molecule. And should patients be saying things like, I'm taking this to improve my blood sugar and reverse my heart disease?
So the best way to put it is, so first of all, again, we're from the biotech community here. So we should, with our physicians, take full advantage of advancements that are being made in medicine. And drugs are a part of it. They just are. So, and in a wonderful way. So using them responsibly, having people in that think about it the way you are, which is just like, let's safety first, above all else, do no harm. Right. And then how to be able to address it. The way I would advise thinking of C15 is we now are understanding it is an essential fatty acid, one that we need to get and maintain certain levels of. A third paper actually just came out in October from Selesky et al., reconfirming. They said, and they went in with a skeptical eye and said, wait, this seems kind of controversial. Is it really even an essential fatty acid? And they walked through all of their steps, and they said, in the end, they concluded, yeah, it's meeting the criteria of an essential fatty acid. So understanding
Congratulations on that, by the way. That was one of the places where people push back and you're like, ooh, she just won another one.
I know. So it's just, and again, let the science, I mean, we waited 10 years to bring this to the world because for all of these reasons, because we're scientists and physicians and veterinarians first. And to say that, hey, I'm a dolphin veterinarian and we're going to bring a saturated fat is a little wacko. And so it really was. And then bringing in the world's experts in longevity, Dr. Short, world experts in fatty acid, Ed Dennis, and to be like, really? Like, really? And then we got to the point where even they were saying, Steph, it's time. Like you have, like we will continue to learn. The research will continue, but you have a moral obligation to help get C15 out into the world, because what you're discovering is that there's signs of deficiencies in it. Because if it's truly an essential fatty acid, there should be a deficiency syndrome. And they're like, you found it in the dolphins. This syndrome is increasing in people, this phenotype, and especially in children. Get to work. And so that was the military part where it's like, we gave you all this money to figure out the problem. You're figuring it out for dolphins. It seems relevant to humans. Start doing that. So anyway, that was a little bit of a,
tie something down before you go to the next chapter. Cause I meant to ask you this earlier. Did the dolphins get better when I assume your California dolphins, the ones that aren't in the wild, are the ones.
Right. Unfortunately, we can't.
Have you tossed them some C15 and seen improvements in their health markers?
Yes, and in fact, I guess what's the best way to put this? We kind of joke around here that no humans were harmed in the making of this dolphin supplement. It actually was out in humans before, because the Navy was like, hey, let's just keep finding fish. Let's change their fish diet and let's find fish that have C15 in it. Unfortunately, what they're finding is that as the waters are changing and the world is changing, it's actually getting harder to find fish with the C15 levels they had even 10 years ago, even the same type of fish. So now they are currently using supplementation.
So to help do the fish make it? I mean, is it essential to fish?
It's in their fat. Yes, I'm thinking it's a great question. I don't know if it's essential for fish, but they probably get it from, because we see it's highest in the algae eating fish. So they're probably getting it from the algae they're eating, and then it makes it into their fat. And then in their skin and the heads, especially, which we found from the dolphins, but those levels are going down. And the Navy's like, we don't have control over that, unfortunately, anymore. So now they're using supplementation. And what the main marker they're looking at, it's the whole syndrome, but their primary marker, which I think is going to hold the same for humans, is fragile red blood cells and anemia. And so that's what they see as the clearest, most clinically relevant change. And we've seen that now in multiple models, and even the recent clinical trial led by Jeff Schwimmer with the C15 supplementation, showing that hemoglobin was raised if you got C15 levels above this critical threshold. So it really, again, cell strengthening is such a simple thing, and the easiest cell to see that effect in from a physician, a clinical standpoint, are red blood cells.
So I'm going to ask a nerdy question. As the hemoglobin being a very good measurement of red blood cells and their lifespan inside circulation, but ferritin was one of the things you brought up as a inflammatory marker, often found associated with anemia, but in many chronic inflammatory diseases, you'll find that a marker of chronic inflammation. So as the hemoglobin's going up, is the ferritin going down?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what's happening with the dolphins is, and now we're understanding this is what's happening in people, and it doesn't happen in mice, which is, I think, why this went hidden for a while, is because so much science is dependent upon mouse model, right?
Oh, yeah.
So we were lucky to have the dolphins, in which, so what was happening is dolphins with low C15, they had less C15 in their red blood cell membrane. The red blood cells became more fragile. So you started seeing their hemoglobin going down, their red blood cell distribution go up. So just showing that, again, you've got it,
Yep.
more fragility, more variation of red blood cell size. Because they had this high number of fragile red blood cells in circulation, there are cells inside of our liver called Kupffer cells, and they're a macrophage, and their job is to sit and wait for fragile red blood cells to come along, and they engulf them exactly, and then recycle the iron. What's happening in this syndrome is you have so many red blood cells that the Kupffer cells are engulfing lots of red blood cells, and that results in excess iron deposition in the liver, leading to exactly. So then we have iron overload in the liver, and then that's where the high ferritin, because it can be inflammation. So you have two things, right? Inflammation or iron overload. And so this in humans has been increasing, and it's called dysmetabolic iron overload syndrome.
Oh, yeah. I see it all the time. I see a lot of it.
That's it. This is it. Yeah. So this is what we're saying, is this is part of a C15 deficiency syndrome. And we were just gifted with dolphins were so clean. They used to have high fat fish, like all of them had high fat fish. And then over a 10-year period, those fish disappeared from our ocean. So they moved to this mix. We had some that got lower C15. It took 3 to 4 years for this syndrome to really develop, the iron to deposit, get enough iron overload to start seeing those elevated liver enzymes. So
you have, I'm going to say clinical, because I'm thinking of the dolphin as a patient. You have clinical evidence that said, we had that, increased ferritin, increased fibrotic deposits in the liver, increased liver enzymes, whichever way you're measuring that. And then you added C15. And again, that in a clean supplement that didn't have the whole fish, because when it's the whole fish, there's a whole bunch of other things it could be, but you added the C15 and you've seen clinically this reversal of the, red cell distribution goes back to a normal homogeneous status. The ferritin is returning to normal. The fibrotic part of the liver is improving. That's all true? Even
more importantly, not the dolphins, because we get, again, the dolphins were the fish and now they're getting supplementation, but in a relevant animal model in the lab. So that mimics this entire fragile red blood cells. It's a model for NASH, which I now is
yeah.
We were able to use pure C15 supplementation in this model for 12 weeks and see the reversal of everything, including stopped iron deposition in the liver, which then decreased the fibrosis, because it was really the iron that was triggering this fibrotic process. So we were then able to show causation the dolphins showed the causation of C15 deficiency. We were then able to take that syndrome and then treat it in a much more controlled setting in the lab with C15.
So can you share which animal are they using?
It was a Japanese rabbit model, so that they used that. And again, it's interesting because, and important because mice don't, when they have the same kind of phenotype, they actually don't get iron overload in their liver. Their iron goes into their spleen or their pancreas. And so all these models for fatty liver disease and fibrosis in mice, there's all these papers saying it's so hard to get mice to develop fibrotic disease and NASH or MASH. And this is a big reason why. They don't mimic what a dolphin or a human gets. So it was really a group in Japan had found this model that was like, we were like, that's what we're seeing in the dolphins. So we were able to, figure that out.
So if we come back to my patient and say they're using this as their treatment plan, I do think I've warned them about this, and I think you see I'm cheering for you. I'm so excited to see this come to the market. But as I tell them, I'm like, your life is depending on whether or not this works, and we are super excited. But the human trials hopefully are happening soon, but haven't happened yet, right?
So there are two clinical trials that happen, and both of them are in populations of fatty liver disease.
Okay.
So
I know you're right. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, oh, that's okay. So one was, and it's actually Jeff Schwimmer, who is a leader in fatty liver disease, specifically in kids and pediatrics. He opened the first fatty liver disease clinic in the world at a time that he was like, we need to care about fat in kids' livers, and everyone else was like, it doesn't matter. It's just fat. He's like, this is going to be a big problem. And that was back in the early 2000s. So Jeff had seen our paper back in 2012 where we published fatty liver disease in dolphins. And
he found you before Science Friday.
He did. So then he's like, because he's seeing this increasing number of patients coming through the door, kids, children, right? And with this accelerated aging profile. So he reached out to me and he's like, I see your paper. And he's like, I don't think it's going to be the same disease. So can you send me some liver samples? And so we sent liver tissue samples that we had archived from about 20 different dolphins. And I'll never forget, Annette, he wrote an email back, and the subject heading is, "We are a go. This is the exact same disease I'm seeing in kids."
I have goosebumps.
Yeah, right? And he's like, what? He's like, and it's not sugar, because he's been pursuing, and again, not to say that sugar is not part of the problem,
right, no,
but for the dolphins, it has nothing to do with carbs, right? So that really helped narrow down. So then Jeff followed up. We've been on a 10-year journey, 12-year journey together, but independently. So then Jeff did a study where he did basically ultrasounds of 350 kids, and he looked at their C15 levels, or all their fatty acid levels, and the amount of fat in their liver. And he published and showed that indeed kids that had higher C15 were inversely associated with fat in their liver. So he's like, okay, now I want to do a clinical trial. So that's what initiated Jeff saying, can I actually intervene and say, give young adults that were his kids when they were patients when they were kids who have a history of fatty liver disease, can I give them C15 supplementation, and will we see physiologic changes, good or bad? Right. And so it was an independently run study by him. And that's what he published a few months back, and showing that if they got C15 levels above what we're identifying as this critical threshold of not being deficient, then he saw decreases in ALT, AST, and an increase in hemoglobin. So all of this saying, and getting back though, Annette, to your initial question, we are not saying C15 is a drug. It is not. It is something we're meant to have, that we should have certain levels of it. And its really heavy lifting job is to prevent and keep us, to keep us healthy in our healthy state for as long as possible. And I think it could be a great ride along under the supervision of a physician, but is in no way, shape, or form intended to say, stop taking your medications for a disease state and start taking this. It is meant to be a buddy. And again, because it's safe, but enjoy that journey under the supervision of your physician if you have a disease state.
Right.
If that helps.
No, all of that in the right lane. When I look at some of the other things that frustrate me is how, getting folks to do things to help them stay healthier. Well, it can be a thankless job. I don't know the number of times I've said,
exercise. It's like, don't tell me exercise.
Don't
tell me healthier diet, right? It's hard.
But if you've Googled my name under YouTube, the second word that comes up these days is sardines. Trying to get patients to say, there are the amount of evidence of me being able to measure your omega-3s. And then when you get them higher, how many other things are getting better? This also is, we have lots of human data that says, don't skip this. Supplementing is great. Sardines if you don't like to supplement it, but either way, we have a mountain of evidence. So before I'm saying, let me tell you that you need to have this next supplement, I'd love to be able to measure it. Is it possible?
There is. And then right before I say that, we want to wrap up, is that there's also a second clinical trial that was done in Singapore. So it's women who have fatty liver disease. And in that one, it was super challenging because they were on a low calorie diet plus Mediterranean plus C15. And then they compared that with people who are low calorie Mediterranean diet or just low calorie. So there's no really control of not getting an intervention. So it's a really heavy lift for C15, but even in that scenario showed that that C15 supplementation resulted in lower LDL cholesterol, healthier gut microbiome, which there's been a bunch of stuff coming out on the gut microbiome of increased growth of Bifidobacterium adolescentis, which is it'll be interesting to see how things pan out. But anyway, so that work has been done.
I just did a podcast yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, with the gut biome experts. Well, I think of them as the experts, but the pendulum folks. And so,
they're great.
Yeah, all these.
They're great.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. So then we get to measuring. So this is critical because if you're going to say a deficiency, one, it better be meaningful. And so Jeff's study helped to repeat what we had already set as what we thought was the level. This was reconfirmed in his study that you needed to get up and over this level in order to see the benefits. So it's in an increasing number of fatty acid panels. So that is just when you're working with your physician, you're working with Dr. Boz, you can look at, does the fatty acid panel include C15? Most people today have about 0.2%, which is equal to 5 micromolars around. And so we know that's what the average of where people are, but they need to actually be above it because the population on average is low because we've decreased our intake of C15. So we know that really the ideal spot is probably around 0.4 to 0.6%. But if you have below 0.2% of C15, that's where we're defining this deficiency syndrome. The cells become more fragile. And that's what sets up all these things that we've talked about. So Genova Diagnostics also developed a specific at-home test for C15, which is great. But to be honest, if you have a fatty acid panel, Genova has one as well that covers all the fatty acids. You might as well get all of them.
Right.
And that includes C15.
So when you look at the supplement that you and your husband have put your heart and soul behind, what is the source material that it comes from? Because I recall that it's not a fish or the fish fat. It's different.
Yes. Okay. So our goal was to ensure that it was a pure, free fatty acid C15, that it wasn't coming from dairy, wasn't coming from fish. And a lot of this is, one, so that it could be vegan friendly, but also because there's only about 1% of these foods have C15 in it. So it wouldn't be a very efficient method. So what we did is C14 is readily available in plants.
That's a naughty one, right?
That's a naughty one, exactly. So it's readily available in things like coconut and nutmeg. And so there's a big industry that has pure C14 available because it's readily available from plants. So we take C14 and we attach a carbon onto it to make C15. And it is pure. There's no isoforms. Like sometimes molecules could be one direction versus another, and that can make a difference in its activities. And C15, as we had talked about, is such a simple, straight molecule. It's bioidentical to what's in, and all the studies I've talked about, the experimental studies and the supplement studies, have all been done with this molecule. So free fatty acid, that makes it more bioavailable. The C15 in foods are attached to triacylglycerides. So we've got to have digestive enzymes to pull off the free fatty acids and absorb them. So we also wanted it to be bioavailable. It's kind of like all the marching orders we had from the Navy to say, do this, and this, so that we can put it to work, not just for the dolphins, but for military folks as well.
Well, and I have my little bottle here that I said, well, I didn't test mine. I just said, no, I'm not going to waste energy on that. Now, I do I have a lot of dairy in my diet. it doesn't upset my body or system. So I wondered, but I probably don't need it. But I mean, my liver enzymes are good and I don't have high ferritin, all that stuff. But I still said, no, I'm going to try it, see what it does. I don't know that I noticed anything, but I didn't have any problems at the beginning either. And my N of 1 doesn't mean anything except there was no side effects. So that's good.
Yeah, that is a super good thing that we have about half of people, and I experienced it myself, and we were not expecting this, with experience within about 2 weeks of improved sleep, less joint pain, and calmer mood. And I was like, well, this is a placebo effect. Like, it's not what it's supposed to do. It doesn't make any sense. And then I experienced it myself. And when we went back to the dolphin data, because again, the research has continued for us and around the world, we found there was we talked about, we did these metabolomics and it ranked what was most important. There's a second molecule at the top, and it's a metabolite of C15. So our bodies use C15 to make this metabolite, and it's called pentadecanoyl carnitine, which is a mouthful, so PDC. And so we published in Scientific Reports in 2022 that this molecule is the second ever discovered full acting endocannabinoid. So fully acting CB1 and CB2. It's like, better sleep, calmer mood, less pain. And what I think in it is that it's a metabolite, which means it's that's when now you become dependent on genes and genetics and variations in people. So I think some people may be more efficient in making this molecule metabolite than others. And so therefore hit or miss on the near term, what we're calling these near term benefits. We still need to do clinical trials on these. We just have a matchup of mechanism of action and reported effects. But the brunt of the research is everything we've been focused about, which is our long-term health. Again, kind of fixing you where you're broken. And if you're not broken, the
Praise
goal
God,
is
right? Yeah. And then,
is to keep us healthy and resilient for as long as possible.
Yes. Well, and I will say that, the persistence of being in a space where the answers are not known. I am so encouraged that you've stayed in the space and continued to put forth information that I think could be helpful to my patients, that I've continued to tell them, I'm going to tell them again, that doesn't mean stop taking the omega-3s. Don't stop taking those things, that we do have human trials, evidence-based. The hope that this gives us some future places where we can push the lever and maybe push the rewind button on disease processes that I wish we could do for many of the patients that I see in my practice. But your molecule seems to have some good sparkle effect around it, and your story is really fun to read. Science Friday did you well.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, we have Simon and Schuster reached out and at the end of last summer, and they said, gosh, this is a book like this, just going through the process of discovery and what you're continuing to do. So that will be a book chock full called The Longevity Nutrient, but it'll be coming out in March, and that it's basically might help put people to sleep because it's 300 pages of C15 science, but it helps feel like what was happening in Japan, and then the research that was happening in the Netherlands, and what was happening like just all over the world. Has just been fascinating and been wonderful to be part of this journey where we have an opportunity to really do something meaningful. And like you said, just the science continues. Yeah.
Well, I will continue to keep an eye on how you're doing, and I would love to just hear your successes when you get them. Let us know, because I'm very anxious to see where the next layers roll out. And when you have the ear of Peter Attia looking into things, I'm sure he echoes through everybody's head when he finds something. So you've got all the right people paying attention.
And we'll tell you about the successes, but we'll tell you about if there are any chinks in the armor.
That's right.
C15 as well, because it's we're all here the whole point is, like you say, we continue to learn as the science comes out, and the science has been building, but we will respond in the way that is appropriate given the science that continues to come. So we'll let you know either way how things are going.
That's great. That's perfect. Well, and good luck with the book. I will be I'll be on the pre-order of that list and get that out to my brain and to other people. That would be helpful. I'd love it. Unfortunately, I would just love it, because
Well, you're nerdy enough that you're a nerd, so I think it'll be fun. It's hopefully a fun read for nerds at least.
Well, we will sign off and say thank you again. We will keep highlighting your product and continue to keep an eye on it. Thank you again for all the work you've done.
Absolutely, thank you. Right back to you. Okay, bye.